Good morning. Now we begin our last day of the Congress on the Origins of Contemporary Philosophy, today with a talk by our friend and longtime collaborator, Professor Guillaume Fréchette, whose talk will be Mach's Theory of Elements, Readings Considered, followed by comments by Lucas Baccarat, also from the University of Geneva, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Professor Fréchette, thank you again for being here. Please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be among you in Sao Paulo, although this time only virtually. So what I want to discuss today is, or what I want to propose today is perhaps a new reading of Mach, which is, well, not very new, but which is, I would say, an alternative, at least, to the kind of views that have been proposed on how to consider Mach's theory of elements. So this is basically what I want to do today. So how to read Mach? So there are two main readings in the contemporary, well, in the 20th century philosophy, one could say. There's the classical or mainstream reading that has been very influential among positivists and logical empiricists, mainly to see Ernst Mach as a phenomenalist, so basically as a positivist, as a defender of anti-metaphysical views or anti-metaphysics in general. Why is that, and how does that work? Well, Mach, of course, was a major influence on the Vienna Circle, on people like Philipp Frank, Otto Neurath, Moritz Schlick, and Rudolf Carnap. And they defended the view in this respect, which was very similar, at least structurally speaking, which was very similar to Mach. And since the Vienna Circle wanted metaphysics to be eliminated from science, where metaphysics meant any term or proposition unverifiable in principle by experience, it is believed that they inherited it from Mach himself. So it was still, again, an account that was very often defended by Sophie, for example, in the 70s. And perhaps it's not so well, so let's say, it's not such a popular account right now in the last couple of years, but it was at least until the 70s and 80s still a very influential one. Of course, I mean, there are direct links to Mach's anti-metaphysische Vorbemerkungen of 1886, not 66. And we find various versions of that reading of Mach being basically an anti-metaphysician, if you like, in Schlick, of course, but in the logical positivists in general, especially in Carnap and Frank, but also among in circles that are not directly associated with logical positivism, namely Husserl, but also Popper, and more recently in his book on Mach, John Blackmore. So this is one very influential reading. The other one, or the alternative reading, is perhaps more metaphysics-friendly, one could say, and it consists in seeing Mach as a neutral monist. And perhaps one of the first who proposed that reasoning was Bertrand Russell in the beginning of the 20th century. So already, I think it is clear later on in the analysis of mind, but even earlier, he says on neutral monism, it's the view that the things commonly regarded as mental and the things commonly regarded as physical do not differ in respect of any intrinsic property possessed by the one set and not by the other, but differ only in respect of arrangement and context. And so more explicitly connected now and linked with Ernst Mach, Russell says in the analysis of mind, neutral monism is by no means a new view. It is advocated not only by the American authors I mentioned, he was talking about William James and John Dewey, but by Mach in his analysis of sensations, which was published in 1886. So neutral monism regarding Mach means, so according to Russell, but also basically according to one of his so defenders in the recent contemporary literature, Eric Banks. So neutral monism regarding Mach means that Machian elements were really physical. So that's an important point here. Were really physical, and that the realistic side of his work has to be fully acknowledged for any understanding of his view, as Russell understood so well. So I put here an asterisk after realistic, because this is a particular use by Banks of the term. What he means by this is realistic empiricism, which is, in his view, a synonym of both, of not only of neutral monism, but also of radical empiricism, so view defended by James and Dewey, and empirio-criticism. So, I mean, this is also problematic. There are some associations here that are not necessarily obvious, but I'm not going to go into that here. The basic point is to say, well, Mach, what was Mach after was a kind of a neutral monism view, so a metaphysic-friendly view. So, are there other alternatives? So the debate is, as it is formulated, and especially when you read the papers by Eric Banks and recent literature since the last 10 or 15 years, the debate is formulated pretty much as a kind of dilemma. So either is Mach a positivist who rejects metaphysical statements as they are not verifiable by experience, or is he defending a metaphysical view? So he's really a metaphysician about the nature of reality. And of course, I mean, neutral monism is a metaphysical view. What does that mean? So more precisely, I mean, of course, there are different options. You can go as a neutral monist. You can be a panpsychist. You can be also what Banks calls a realistic empiricist, which doesn't imply some kind of panpsychism, but in one way or the other, you're defending a metaphysical view. So, as a piece of history of philosophy, I think this seems to be an odd debate, and this is also part of what I want to show or suggest here in the next couple of minutes. So, people like Banks, people working on Russell and James and Mach in connection with one another, are sometimes, and especially I would say in the philosophy of science and in the history of philosophy of science, tends to reconstruct these views as if there were purely philosophical views and that's the views that are reconstructing, particularly in this case neutral monism, sometimes seems to be like an immanent reading of Mach. But neutral monism is a reception of Ernst Mach, as is phenomenalism, or the phenomenalist reading is a reception of Ernst Mach among people from the Vienna Circle. So this is something that people in history or in philosophy of science don't tend to do much, that we do perhaps more in history of philosophy, to distinguish between, I would say, like the philosophical view, the content of the view, and the reception. And in that case, I think these views are just two receptions. So that's why I'm proposing here a third view, which I think is legitimate for this reason, that it is also a reception. And it seems also to me an odd debate, because Mach's view, of course, evolved over time and was received differently by different audiences. And as I said, well, formulated as such, it is a debate between the reception of Mach by logical positivism versus the reception of Mach in early analytic philosophy. And why should these receptions give us any privileged insight into Mach's motivation or in the correct interpretation of his theory of elements? So my suggestion here is to complicate the things a little bit and to add a third reading, the reading that I will be presenting shortly here in the next couple of minutes. It is, I was not very original on my title for the reading. I just call it the Graz reading for reasons that the early Mach was had a position in Graz when he wrote Die Bemerkungen zur Theorie des räumlichen Sehens, which I use in my reconstruction. This was one thing. The other thing is that Ehrenfels and Meinong, two students of Brentano, were in Graz and developed this interpretation of Mach and adaptation of Mach into their conception of Gestalt qualities, and in the case of Ehrenfels and in the case of Meinong, it's Gegenstandstheory. So, if you like, Graz is just here an umbrella term to designate these philosophers belonging more or less to the Brentano tradition, to the tradition initiated by Franz Brentano. And so I think what they were interested in were actually what these people that I would say defended a reading that I would call the Graz reading, what they found as central, what they took as central in Mach were two theses in Mach's philosophy. First is the non-causal dependence thesis. It's the thesis that the forms in perceptions are recognized as the same to melodies. The fact that the forms are recognized as the same, for example, to melodies or to complexes of sensations, depends on the structure of our sensations. So this is the non-causal dependence thesis. They are dependent, if you like, on the structure of sensations, but they're not causally dependent on it. I'll just explain it a little bit later. And the second thesis, which is often not really much into the discussion between, in the dilemma between the neutral monism thesis and the phenomenalism thesis, is the complementarity thesis that Mach defends in his early lectures on psychophysics from 1865. The idea that psychology, physics, and physiology are complementary sciences. So the complementarity thesis doesn't imply physicalism. It doesn't also imply phenomenalism. So it is metaphysically neutral in that respect. And this is a thesis that is not very often considered, but it plays a central role in Mach. So the Graz reading suggests to see Mach as metaphysically neutral, I suggest. Not as a monist, but not as a phenomenalist or an anti-metaphysic kind of guy, as people in the Vienna Circle liked to see him. I think this reading or this approach has two advantages. So it is compatible to some extent with the two other readings. It's not so much a competing view. I think if we consider these views as actually reconstructions of receptions, they are of course perfectly able to cohabitate one with the other, so they're compatible to some extent with the two other readings. But they also take into account, or the Graz reading takes into account a wide reception of Mach in the school of Brentano that doesn't match with the reconstruction provided by the two other readings. So this is basically my motivation behind this talk. So let's go first to the phenomenalist reading, just to say exactly what I mean by this. And then after this, in my second part, I will discuss a bit the neutral monist view, and then I'll present my own take on this. So I already spoke for 15 minutes. So how much time do I have? Actually, I don't know. Oh, the microphone's not on.
Sorry, Professor. I think you have still 1 hour and 20 minutes, a bit more, yeah. 1 hour and 20 minutes, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't get that.
Okay, so you still have 1 hour and 20 minutes or a bit more.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't think I will talk for so long, but I'm just wanted to be sure that I don't exceed any time that were decided before. So I wasn't sure about this, but it's good. So might have perhaps 30-40 minutes more. Okay. So what I want to do again, discuss a bit the phenomenalist reading. expose what is in the background of this neutral monist reading, and then I'll present what I consider to be the advantages of the so-called Graz reading, or we could call it also a phenomenological reading, but I think it would be also very confusing, because this is not so much a phenomenological view. It is a view that is actually relatively neutral. Okay, so what is the basic idea in the phenomenalist reading? So perhaps the reception of Mach, that was the most important, starting perhaps with Schlick, and then later on in the Vienna circle with Neurath and even Carnap. So Mach was, in their view, and the view from the Vienna circle, but also of other people, of Popper and also Husserl, was a phenomenalist who only believed in given human sensations, and who held that everything else was unverifiable metaphysical nonsense. It matches well with Mach's historical influence on the members of the Vienna circle. Of course, this gives an explanation on why they were influenced by Mach, so to speak. And it seems also to explain both Mach's negative skepticism about atoms and his positive skepticism about Newton's absolute space. So the reading has some advantages, because it also takes these aspects of Mach's philosophy of science in consideration. So John Preston, in a paper on Mach, on phenomenalism, Mach and phenomenalism, listed a couple of cues in Mach's analysis of sensation, on why actually people were reading Mach, at least for some time, at some point, as a phenomenalist. First, well, the way in which Mach understands our existing substance concepts of bodies and egos as complexes of elements. Also, the second cue is that the way in which he ties sensations to the subject. And it's also interesting to note that, of course, Mach is talking about sensations. Of course, later on, he will use the term Elemente, which is, let's say, more heading towards some kind of neutral monism. But when you talk of elements as Empfindungen, as sensations, it suggests, of course, a kind of phenomenalistic reading. So the way he ties the sensations to the subject is characterization of sensations and elements as given, is actual examples of sensations and elements. The way also in which its sensations and elements are supposed to depend on the physiology of the senses, and is characterization of spaces and times as sensations. So I think when you open the book Analysis of Sensation, and when you read it, perhaps with a fresh perspective on Mach, a lot of it seems to go into the direction of some version of phenomenalism, and it would make a lot of sense also, given the psychology that came before Mach and the context in which Mach discusses his thesis. Many of the authors he mentions, he discusses, are phenomenalists, so it would make somehow sense to build up this reading. It's not absolutely unjustified. On the contrary, I think there are very good points to support this reading. We see perhaps in Schlick an even more radical version of Mach's phenomenalism. So Schlick was even thinking that Mach was actually giving into solipsism. So that was very, very early on. So in a sense, so Schlick was opposed to Mach, although he accepted many of Mach's point, for example, the principle of economy, but he was also very critical on the kind of phenomenalism he at least attributed to Mach. So we see it in the Probevorlesung from 1909-1910, on which bears the title Idealism and Its Refutation. He says the claim that only sensations exist, of course he's referring to Mach by saying that, has a dogmatic character. According to Schlick, Mach was unable to avoid the presumption of the transcendental, the principle which only allows us to consider the directly given and does not permit any transcendental assumptions, leads to solipsism. And Schlick's conclusion is that in his efforts, in Mach's efforts to save himself from solipsism, he then falls into metaphysical idealism and is unable to remain true to his own critical intentions and premises. So, in other words, according to Schlick, Mach's position is so radical that actually the phenomenalism he defends leads to a kind of metaphysical idealism and falls into the solipsism that is related to it. But Schlick, at the same time, as I already said, acknowledges Mach's influence regarding the principle of economy. So we find also notes in this Probevorlesung going into that direction where he says, this truth that the aim of all knowledge is to represent the maximum of facts with the smallest possible number of concepts, we call the principle of the economy of thought. So it essentially suggests that the drive for knowledge is most fully satisfied when thinking is as economical as possible in the use of concepts. So, so this is, let's say, the general idea behind the attribution of phenomenalism to Mach, or the phenomenalist reading of Mach. And again, as I said, I think there are many elements or points, let's say, in the analysis of sensations that suggest that. Now, there's this second reading that was actually perhaps more influential in, I would say, in early analytic philosophy. If we want to distinguish between the Vienna Circle and early analytic philosophy, then perhaps this would be one point or one way to distinguish it, the way they understood Mach. So in Russell's view, Mach was actually defending a kind of neutral monism. Russell didn't agree at all with the Vienna Circle on the interpretation of Mach. But what is neutral monism actually? So what kind of view is that, and what, and especially in context and in connection with the philosophy of science, what does that mean? So in their paper on neutral monism, Stubenberg and Wischon write that Mach operates on the assumption. So, I mean, they defend also the view that Mach was a neutral monist. And they say, well, Mach operates on the assumption that all sciences form whole, and the great virtue of neutral monism is that it affords a unified perspective from which scientific inquiry can be undertaken. What I aimed at, says Mach, was merely to attain a safe and clear philosophical standpoint, whence practicable paths shrouded in no metaphysical clouds might be seen leading not only into the fields of physics, but also into that of psychophysiology. And so this is basically what neutral monism means, according at least to Stubenberg and Wischon. It is a bridge between different sciences. And this is also an idea that we find in Russell, in the analysis of mind again. So neutral monism is characterized as an attempt to harmonize two different tendencies, one in psychology, the other in physics, vis-a-vis the materialistic tendency of psychology and the anti-materialistic tendency of physics. So this is basically one of the reasons why it would make sense, according to Stubenberg and Wischon, to read Mach as a phenomenalist because of his holism, basically. So now the Banks version. Banks wrote a tremendous amount of articles and very important book also on Mach's neutral monism, and he's really has developed this view since, I don't know, 15 years. It has been it was something that he was very much after, but it is also a philosophical view that he himself defends. So he agrees with Mach, but he also extracts Banks. He also extracts a philosophical view out of this reconstruction. So to present the view, he says this in his book on Mach, James, and Russell. He says, I think it is clear that the sensation elements, such as blue, are assumed to be complex electrochemical brain events, and that blue is simply how the physical powers manifested in these sorts of configured events appear to us. From outside the brain, the same event of our seeing the blue will appear to an external observer as a complex firing pattern of 10,000 complexly configured neurons. If the external observer siphons off the neural energy into 10,000 electrodes, the event of seeing blue will vanish from the internal observer, which is what you would expect if they were identical in some way. If the external observer then reconfigures the 10,000 events along wires in exactly the same way with exactly the same causal powers, it would also expect the blue sensation to be recreated within the complex of powers and manifestations in the wires. If any such explanation is workable or even just logically coherent, so this kind of pure identification between what we used to call the firings of the C cells and brain. So there's an identity theory here. If any such explanation is workable or even just logically coherent, I see absolutely no reason why it can be claimed a priori that sensory qualities such as blue could not possibly be physical events, as is often done. It seems to me that a priori arguments or intuitions have nothing to do with the question whether sensations are physical. So this is the bit, as I just said, this is the philosophical view that Eric Banks extracts from Mach. But so this is his own view, but he also attributes it to Mach. So that kind of identity theory between like mental events and physical events, so they're just the same. We just have different views or different perspectives on them, which is actually at the bottom. It is not a neutral view. It's called neutral monism, but it's not a neutral view in the sense that actually all boils down to physical elements. So this is why it is also kind of realism in their view, in Eric Banks' view at least. Okay. Good. So Russell saw Mach's, according to Banks, so Russell saw Mach's basic insight about the physicality of sensation as a breakthrough and as a new truth for being the strange hold of the mind-body problem. Russell said Mach argued that our sensations are part of the physical world. So here again, this neutral monism view that boils down to the physical world are parts of the physical world, and thus inaugurated the movement towards neutral monism. And even before his own conversion to the view in 1918, because first Russell criticized the view, but then quite interestingly, he adopted the view a couple of years later. Russell accepted as a service to philosophy Mach's and James' idea that what is experienced may itself be a part of the physical world and is often so, or that constituents of the physical world can be immediately present to me. And I mean, there are also, I mentioned the parts in the analysis of sensations that are suggesting a phenomenalist reading. But there are also parts in other texts of Mach that suggest the neutral monist reading, and it's also important to mention them. And one that I find particularly interesting is quoted by Banks, but it was first published by Haller and Stadler, also in Mach, Leben und Werk und Wirkung in the 80s, I think. It is a part from lectures that Mach gave on main points of physics from 1872. So this is taken from Banks' translation. So Mach says, sensation is a general property of matter. So this goes again exactly in the direction neutral monism wants to go, right? Sensation is a general property of matter, more general than motion, says Mach. Let us seek to set down this proposition clearly. An organism is a system of molecules. electric currents run into the interior and come back again to the muscles. Everything is physically explainable. But not that the person should have sensations. What we can investigate physically is always merely physical. We find no sensation. And yet the human being senses. The material flows forward and through him. The old departs, the new comes in. We have therefore the problem of finding something fundamentally new in the whole that is not in the parts. We escape this difficulty when we consider sensation as a general property of matter. And then he goes on a little bit later, he says, what scientific values this assumption of sensation as a general property of matter has, this can only be decided by how much better we can deduce and understand physical phenomena through them. Rules for deduction of our sensations with the help of other sensations added in thought and in causal relation to them. Thus, as the most immediate goal of science, the construction of the world out of sensations. The appearance of matter, insofar as it is sensation, build up similar to the way physics has built up material added in thought. So this suggests strongly the kind of neutral monism view, actually, that is advocated by Banks, but also even by Russell. They didn't have access to these lecture notes of Mach, and this is, I think, a quite clear formulation of, let's say, the neutral monism view. And that's what Banks says about this passage, actually. He says, what seems clear is that world elements played a very significant role in the development of Mach's neutral monism. They were not a later add-on to a phenomenalist view, as it might appear from a cursory read of the analysis of sensation. Recognizing the role qualitative elements could play in the construction of matter, qualitative elements here being sensations, could play in the construction of matter as well as in the construction of mind, appears to convince Mach that the elements were ideally suited to play a role that is neutral between the two, and that the two categories could henceforth be abandoned in favor of the elements in one natural array capable of constructing both mind and matter. That view made its first appearance at the end of Mach's history and root of the principle of the conservation of energy in 1872. But again, I think this is one important point to stress when you defend, or when you want to say, well, Mach was really, when you look at these manuscripts from 1872, look at the conclusion of the principle of conservation of energy in 72, it was neutral monism. Well, one important upshot, I think, of this view is that, when you use this neutral monism view, then you have to advocate for unobservable posits. You have to accept unobserved posits in your theory. And that goes quite against Mach's conviction about the unreality of atoms. So Mach was, later on he accepted the reality of atoms, but the most of his life, he was one of the last philosopher, he was perhaps the last physicist to accept Einstein's theory. So it was actually quite a strong conviction of Mach that you cannot just admit unobservable entities. So if we give some importance to that conviction, then perhaps these quotes about neutral monism are not telling us, the whole story. So this, I think, should be also taken into consideration. So we had the phenomenalist reading, we had the let's say neutral monism reading, and I think for different reasons, both of them give us an account that is plausible, of course, of Mach's philosophy. They give us also an account which is not only plausible but coherent and also relevant, because it can account for many aspects of Mach's doctrine, but there are flaws in both of them, I think. And the account that I'm proposing is not It's not flawless neither. I think there are also flaws. But what I'm proposing here, what I call the Graz reading, is just to focus on different aspects of Mach's philosophy, and that can be helpful to see exactly. So, okay, what was Mach actually after? Perhaps there were also other elements that played a role in his philosophical view, if he had one, because of course Mach was disputing the fact or the thesis or the assumption that he was a philosopher. So, but let's put that aside here in this context. So, as I said, the Graz reading is based basically on two theses, or what I call the Graz reading, because this is my invention, if you like. So that's the non-causal dependence thesis, and that's the complementarity thesis. So let's go first on the non-causal dependence thesis. We find a forerunner of this thesis in early Mach in the Bemerkungen zur Lehre vom räumlichen Sehen from 1865. And this is actually a text, a marginal text, that wasn't really much received, actually, but that was well known, that was read also by Christian von Ehrenfels. So this is also why I'm quoting this here in this passage, where Mach says, just as the same differently colored forms, the same muscular sensations must occur if the forms are to be recognized as the same. So to each and every to each and every form, each and every abstraction, as one might say, must in just the same way be based upon presentation of a quite particular quality. This holds true for space and shape, as well for time, rhythm, pitch, the form of melodies, intensity, and so on. So it's not here merely a correlation that you have between the qualitative content that you perceive, color patches, forms, etc., and the muscular sensation that you have. It's not that when one occurs, the other occurs as well. It's that when one occurs, then necessarily the other occurs exactly in that specific way. So there's a necessary connection. That's not causality, not necessarily causality, but it's a necessary connection. That what Mach has in mind here between the muscular sensations, we could say in the case of the Brentanian or the later psychology from the Brentano school, the acts of and the correlation between the acts and the contents, if you like. So here Mach speaks of a necessary connection between the structure of the muscular sensations and the structure of the perceived form. It is, as I just said, it is a relation which is of course stronger than non-causal dependence because it involves necessity. So, but in the analysis of sensation, that talk of necessity disappeared. We don't have any relations of that kind in the later Mach. Mach talks of Mach doesn't talk of a necessary connection or an intimate mutual relation as he did in his early text. What we find is only a connection or dependence between the sensations and the elements. So, and further, this dependence is seen as being in every case relative to the perspective or point of view adopted by the investigator. So a color, so to quote Mach from the analysis of sensations, a color is a physical object as long as we consider its dependence upon its luminous source, other colors, heat, spaces, etc. But if we consider its dependence upon the retina, then it is a psychological object of sensation. So what we have is that we determine objects in terms of the relation of function, in terms of a relation of functional dependence. Functional here means that, depending on the particular focus that we have on, or on the function that we are looking at. So is it a psychological function? Is it a physiological function, etc.? So this is what he means here by dependence and more generally by functional dependence. Okay. So what we find here, this relation of functional dependence in Ehrenfeld's reading, it turns out like this. It is for Ehrenfeld, so Ehrenfeld's interpretation here of Mach is that there is something that we perceive through specific types of complex networks of acts of presentations, sensory, imagination, memory, etc., whenever we perceive a memory of a Gestalt quality. So a Gestalt quality, if you don't know what that is what people like Mach, of course, introduced a little bit this idea, but the concept was introduced more specifically by Ehrenfeld and was developed further later on in the school of Brentano and in the early psychology. The basic idea is that when we perceive a form, let's say you perceive a triangle pictured on the board or in a picture, and you see three faces, you see these three sides, well, you're not perceiving just a series or a complex of elements. You perceive a complex of elements in a certain arrangement, in a certain form. So these forms, so to speak, that are things that you can perceive according to Ehrenfeld. So this is the idea here behind it. Okay, so Ehrenfeld's view on Gestalt qualities and Mach's view on sensation, what he called earlier muscular sensations, are different, but they share one central element. They stand to their underlying elements in relation of non-causal dependence. So here Ehrenfeld follows that thesis from Mach. The non-causal dependence in the case of Ehrenfeld, what it means? Well, it means that a Gestalt quality, for example, a melody. I spoke of a triangle with three sides, but the melody is basically the same. It just unfolds in time. Melody is just, it's not just a series of notes, it's a series of notes in a certain arrangement. Okay. So a Gestalt quality, for example, a melody, depends on a particular network of acts to be perceived, but does not depend causally on it. It is not because you have, so to speak, this network of acts that the melody exists. There is not this kind of causal dependence. It doesn't depend causally on it. Your perceiving the melody doesn't cause the melody, if you like. And non-causal dependence or functional dependence in Mach in 1886, it's exactly formulated in that quote that I already mentioned. A color is a physical object as long as we consider its dependence from its luminous source. Other color, heats, spaces, etc. But if we consider its dependence upon the retina, then it's a psychological object, a sensation. And we find also, when it comes later on, because of course this is 86 and Mach's view evolves, of course, but when we look at Erkenntnis und Irrtum from 1905, where he speaks more clearly about functional dependence, we see that it is that it developed that view further on in adapting it also to the laws of physics. So he says, when an equation is satisfied, then there is involved therein a widened and generalized concept of substance. In general, it matters little whether we regard the equations of physics as expressions concerning substances, law or forces, for at all events, they express functional dependencies. So the laws of physics, they just express the relation of functional dependence. They don't say anything about whatever that is, what we are talking about. Is that a physical object? Is that a color? Is that a wavelength? It's just about the functional dependence relation. And so we find this, of course, in Ehrenfeld's an interesting idea on this. Ehrenfeld is not saying anything about what the melody consists in. What he's interested is that the melody consists in this kind of functional dependence of the elements upon the whole. So this is what is interesting in the connection here between Mach and Ehrenfeld. So this is the non-causal dependence thesis. So the second thesis is what I call the complementarity thesis, and it concerns not so much the relation between the elements and the complex and the elements between them, but it concerns the relation between different sciences. And this is an interesting point when we're talking about the reception of Mach, because we see also a similar concern in Meinong later on, and of course at different degree also in Brentano and in other researchers from that time working, let's say, at the juncture between physiology, psychology, and physics. And Mach is perhaps the best case for these kind of work at junctures. So we find the complementarity thesis, the first version of it actually, or at least, in Mach's early lectures on psychophysics. And so these were translated, I think, in English pretty early by Titchener. They were published in newspapers at the time. So these are lectures meant for a wide for a wide publicum, not for academics necessarily. So he says, that's I think at the end or towards the end of the last paper, he says physics, physiology, and psychology are inevitably bound up with one another, so that each one finds its salvation only in the companionship of the others, and each one may be regarded as handmaid of the others. So at that time, Mach was aware, and perhaps other people also, Fechner certainly also in a similar sense, were aware that we have here three competing sciences that actually are dealing somehow with the same thing, but from a different perspective. So what can we say about that thing that they are dealing with? It's very hard to tell, but perhaps there's a way of considering, these different ways of dealing with the thing, if there is something like this. Perhaps we could try to find a way of considering this way of dealing with the common thing that they are interested in as a complementarity view or a complementarity thesis. And this idea is taken up also by Meinong later on in 1904, where he says existing sciences such as psychology, physics, or physiology assign what we generally call color to the kind of object they study. Consequently, for Meinong, if psychology, physics, and physiology agree that violet stands between red and blue, expresses a true proposition, there must be something else than psychological phenomena, physiological responses, or wavelengths that red, blue, and violet designate if this agreement is substantial and not merely verbal. And correlatively, there must also be a science, this is Meinong's point, there must also be a science distinct from psychology, physics, and physiology that deals with such objects and that allows us to assess the truth of the proposition in question. So this is where Meinong and Mach, of course, departs from one another. I think the conclusion that Meinong takes from the fact that that these sciences, so to speak, have a different perspective on the same thing. For Mach, it's just science works like this. We have different sciences and they work together exactly in that way. For Meinong, of course, as a philosopher, thinks, well, there must be one science, of course, that deals with these elements, or Meinong called them Gegenstand. And so that's why he calls his theory Gegenstandstheorie. But actually, these objects are formal objects in Meinong's theory. Okay, but I'll come back to this later. So this is from his essay on Gegenstandstheorie, this kind of pamphlet that he wrote in 1904. And that also gives an account of why he actually introduced the Gegenstandstheorie. And it's an interesting passage because in this passage, Meinong starts from this very concern that Mach formulates in 1863. He says, if physics, physiology, and psychology agree in asserting the so-called ideal character of sense qualities, they implicitly assert something about color as well as about sound, namely that the one exists no more than the other. Those who like paradoxical modes of expression could very well say, there are objects of which it is true that they are not such, that they are no such objects. The fact familiar the world over, which is meant by this statement, throws such a bright light on the relation of objects to reality and more generally to being, that a somewhat close examination of the matter, which is of fundamental importance in its own right, is entirely in place in our study. So what I wanted to point out with this quote is that the motivation for the Gegenstands theory, and especially for the very problematic thesis that is attributed correctly to Meinong since 100 years, namely that there are objects of which it is true that there are no such objects. So why would Meinong defend such a view? Well, his motivation is that, well, these sciences, physics, physiology, and psychology, they must be talking about something, so about some identical object. And for this identical object that they are talking about, we cannot say if it exists or no. So certainly this object, the Gegenstand in Meinong's sense, is something of which is something that could also have contradictory properties in his view. So this is the connection with the Gegenstands theory. So in 1904, in the Gegenstands theory of 1904, the argument of Meinong is set up as an argument for the ideality of colors. So Meinong wants to argue that colors are actually ideal objects. But in 1903, Meinong argues about the complementarity thesis on the basis of the manifoldness of color. And I think this is a different argument that he uses in favor of the complementarity thesis, and that connects perhaps a bit better to Mach than the Gegenstands theory. So Konrad Zindler, who was one of Meinong's students, stressed that Riemann himself remarked that with the exception of places, colors are the only example of an ordered and continuous multiplicity in everyday life. In short, the idea developed in Zindler and in Meinong in the paper I mentioned on the color perception is the following. The relations between colors may be represented in the multiple dimensions of psychology, physics, and physiology. These relations remain the same independently of the dimensions in which we deal with them. Colors, in that sense, should therefore be treated as formal objects. So formal objects here is just words that I use to characterize some of the objects in the Brentanian tradition, but we could also use here elements that would also make a perfect sense. So Meinong's position actually accommodates a position such as Mach's on the complementarity of psychology, physiology, and physics. What we call scene color, or what is called nervous stimulation, or even wavelengths, are just different in various connections, what Mach calls relations of functional dependence between the same basic elements. There is no privileged science between psychology, physiology, and physics. These are just different and various arrangements or connections of the same basic elements. So, what is the upshot of the Graz reading that I just proposed? So, first, the non-causal dependence thesis. So, with the non-causal dependence thesis, you can accommodate the kind of holism defended by Mach without defending a kind of priority monism of the whole over the part, or a neutral monism a la Russell. So you don't have to argue for a kind of physicalist view. If you argue you don't have to attribute. What I mean is that you don't have to attribute to Mach some kind of neutral monism or some kind of physicalism. If you attribute to him, or if you stress the importance of the non-causal dependence thesis. I think it covers, if you want to explain, of course, if you want to explain or give an account of Mach's holism. My point here is just, well, if you account for Mach's holism in terms of a non-causal dependence thesis, then you can spare yourself some of the metaphysical suppositions of the neutral monism view. In short, you can remain metaphysically neutral without committing to monism or dualism. And what I mean by metaphysically neutral is, of course, very different from neutral monism. What I mean is that you remain neutral on the nature, on the metaphysical nature of the entities you're talking about. This is metaphysical neutrality. In the case of neutral monism, you don't remain neutral on the end. You accept, of course, that there are entities, and you say, well, either they are neither physical nor mental, or you give a statement on the nature of these entities. So I think it has an advantage to account for holism in terms of non-causal dependence thesis. It has an advantage in this view, in this respect. But also, it preserves the anti-metaphysics intuition that we had in the phenomenalist reading of Mach's philosophy, of Mach's analysis of sensation. So that kind of metaphysical neutrality, I think, is more apt to address this issue that Mach addresses in the anti-metaphysischen Bemerkungen, Vorbemerkungen. I think the problem with the neutral monism view is that if you try to account for Mach's very critical view about metaphysics, then it makes it difficult because this is a metaphysical view. So, so this is for the advantages of the non-causal dependence thesis. What about now the complementarity thesis? Well, I think you can argue for Mach's point about the unity of science by using the complementarity thesis without presupposing a logical positivist view and without understanding it à la Russell as a kind of unity between materialism and anti-materialism. And this is, I think, the way Meinong and also others in the Brentano school, but more particularly Meinong, took the suggestion and developed that further in a way, of course, which is very different from Mach, but the idea was preserved. The basic idea was preserved, at least. So, and perhaps one last slide or one last word on why we should, the lesson or the take-home message, perhaps, of what I've been talking about in the last 57 minutes. So, from an historical perspective, the phenomenalist reading proposed by Schlick and others, but particularly by Schlick, and the neutral monist reading à la Russell are motivated by concrete preoccupations, I think, historically speaking. In the case of Schlick, it is connected with this critique of solipsism. In the case of Russell, it is connected with understanding what he considered to be at some point the real, the correct metaphysical view, namely the neutral monist view. So these views normally, and that's what I thought. That's what I also said in the introduction. These views are often considered to be, at least in the philosophy of science, something like pure philosophical views, but they're not just philosophical views or pure philosophical views. They are also concrete receptions. And for this reason, I think they cannot give us neither the phenomenalist reading nor the neutral monist reading. They cannot give us the final and correct construction of Mach. And this, I think we have to accept it, although when we read these people, they are really proposing this view as actually what Mach actually meant or what he actually wanted to say. And I think these views are just conditioned by the reception that they were of Mach's view, and these receptions are, of course, driven by some concrete preoccupations. And but this is good news, if you like, if you accept this, because it makes room for further views, such as the Graz reading. And I think focusing on this reception would give us, this is of course Zukunftsmusik, and this is a research that I intend perhaps to conduct in the next couple of months, but focusing on this could give us a broader picture of actually what kind of philosopher and scientist Mach was. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fréchette, for a wonderful talk. We'll now have comments by Lucas Lehrer with Geneva.
Thank you very much, Fréchette. That was very interesting, and I'm just as puzzled by Mach's theories of elements as you are. And I also think so can you hear me well? Okay. And I also think the secondary literature is quite hard to grasp all over the place. And I think your reading is very interesting. So the first remark I would make is there a sense of talking about known causal dependencies in Mach? Because Mach has a very extremely deflationary view of causality itself. So those are causal relations in Mach's sense, in a way. So because for him, a causal relation is nothing but a functional dependence itself. So, and that's also the part of your presentation that puzzled me the most. I always understood Mach's functional dependence as if in line with developments of the psychophysical parallelism tradition. So since back now. And which is understanding it as a sort of mathematical function in which if one side of the function changes, the other one also changes. A lot of open questions remain after that, of course. So are there like dependent variables and independent variables? What are the relations between the both sides of the function? And those are very hard to explain. But if I got you right, so you're claiming that what Mach takes, you're making a different interpretation of what a function is. So a functional dependence is not purely a mathematical relation, but like a kind of contextualism. It's the role that an element plays within a complex. Is that what you're saying? So it's a stronger claim. And then what I would ask is, how can Mach in such austere basis, in which you have only but nothing but elements and relations between them, how can he actually claim that you have different kinds of functions? So that something exerts a psychological function and something exerts a physical function. Because it doesn't seem to me, so if you don't have any kind of causal powers attributed to the elements within the complex, you cannot really explain the different functions that the element plays within this complex. So for instance, in the analysis of sensations, when describing what sensations are and the role they play within a body, he says sensations are agreeable or disagreeable. That is to say, our body reacts by means of more or less intense movements of approach or retreat, which in turn present themselves to introspections as complex of sensations. So it does seem that disagreeability, which is something also very important in the psychophysical tradition, plays a kind of causal role. So the element has a causal role that changes the movement of the body itself. And in that sense, you can justify it since it's a relation between an element and a specific complex, a body, and the role it plays that, and you can say, oh, that's a kind of psychological function that it plays. But since you eliminate any kind of causal role that the elements plays into the complex, I don't know how can you actually make the distinction between physical relations and psychological relations. That would be my most important question, I guess. The second claim I'll make, so I think that Banks does accommodate the anti-metaphysical claims of Mach. He just says, and I think he's right about that. So whatever Mach calls metaphysics is extremely vague. So he's rejecting a certain kind of metaphysics, and I would claim the same apply to the Vienna Circle. So you can make the distinction between like revisionary metaphysics and descriptive metaphysics, and you could say Mach would be totally fine with descriptive metaphysics, because descriptive metaphysics is something that it can actually come up with some sort of confirmation or evidence for, and so Mach's most important dictum would be where neither confirmation or disconfirmation is not at play, so science is not concerned, and that's the line that he draws between metaphysics and anti-metaphysics. So a lot of contemporary metaphysics would fit the bill in that regard. including a kind of neutral monism in Bank's claim. What I think you didn't address, and that's definitely a problem for Bank's theory, is that at the beginning of the analysis of sensations, Mach is very clear in claiming that the problem that I see in psychology nowadays is that they do it all in a very physical way. So I want to make it explicit that you have psychological counterparts for certain kind of physiological developments that are relevant to explain, and that you cannot conflate like physical space and psychological space. And he makes all those distinctions, talk about memory traces and how memory distinguishes from the memory traces itself. And I don't think those are extremely well explained in this kind of idea of Banks, which is the most extreme form of neutral monism in which everything is physical. So those are the two. And another claim I would make, and that's also a historiographical claim, I think the reception of Mach in the Vienna Circle is much more diverse than what you painted there. Of course, Schlick has clearly a phenomenalist reading of Mach and also of Abenatus and all the empiricists. Kahn in the Aufbau, it's hard to actually tell. So, because of his metaphysical deflationism, he doesn't seem to commit himself to any kind of phenomenalism itself as well. So, that is a tricky question, but Neuhardt for sure explicitly rejected the idea that Mach was a phenomenalist in several letters. So he has letters between Neuhardt and von Master, and he always claimed the idea that Mach in the analysis of sensations poses something like a solipsist phenomenalism is completely wrong, and actually we should not give any kind of priority to the analysis of sensations in regards to Mach's epistemological view than to his other historical philosophical texts, especially in the sense of mechanics, in which he explains his views much better. And he actually tries to paint Mach as a proto-physicalist in that regard. So I would claim, like, just saying that Vienna Circle interpretation of Mach as a phenomenalist, that could be a little bit more complex, but those would be my points.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for this. I'll just start with your third point, but then I'm curious to hear more about Neurath on Mach in this context, because but I think you will have a lot to say on this at some later moments or something. So I'm really looking forward to it. But you're right. I mean, some part of what I've said on the phenomenalist reading, or some attributions that I made, are perhaps a bit over exaggerated in a sense, because I agree with you. I mean, the reception within the Vienna Circle is more nuanced than what I suggested. But I think, there is a reception, there is a phenomenalist reception of Mach that is indebted to the Vienna Circle, I think. And that probably also influenced the way Popper understood Mach, that I don't know if it was now also a question of influence, but Husserl is perhaps a distinct case, but there is a phenomenalist interpretation coming from the Vienna Circle, but you're right, this does not mean that everyone in the Vienna Circle read Mach in that way. I agree with you on this. So on your third point, thanks for pointing that out. On your second point on James, and on that was James, right? Because I wasn't sure I heard it correctly.
No, it was about Eric Banks' interpretation.
Banks, okay.
Yeah, Banks.
okay. Okay, good. That's good that I asked. So you suggested that Banks has I wasn't sure, so perhaps you could just precise a bit, that Banks has a confusing or vague view of what he means by metaphysics, or what he attributes to Mach as metaphysics?
What I claim is, so what you said is, so the phenomenalist reading is, so you said that the upshot of the phenomenalist reading is that it makes justice to Mach's anti-metaphysical.
Yeah.
And whereas the Banks interpretation portrays Mach as a metaphysician himself. But what I claimed is that in Banks, he makes an effort to accommodate Mach's anti-metaphysical spirit to his own thesis by claiming that what Mach talked about metaphysics was a kind of what we nowadays would call like revisionary metaphysics, and that he would be fine with a kind of descriptive metaphysics. And
yes. Well, absolutely, and it was also, I mean, that's what I also that's also the way I understand Banks' point when he's developing his so-called philosophical view on top of Mach, and that helps him to highlight the kind of metaphysics that he attributes to Mach as being actually perfectly okay with the so-called anti-metaphysical claim. So you could, I mean, I think in Banks' view, you can certainly like make these two views, let's say the anti-metaphysical view, and let's say a revisionary view of metaphysics, like to use the term you use. I mean, that can work together. So I think in Banks' view, that's perfectly okay. But that presupposes again that the metaphysics that Mach has in mind is some kind, when he writes his anti-metaphysische Vorbemerkungen, is some kind of descriptive, or I wouldn't call it even descriptive, but is some kind of let's say outdated substance metaphysics, substance and quality metaphysics, something like almost so caricatural somehow. And I mean, that's not clear. I think it's not clear exactly also what Mach actually means by metaphysics. I mean, there are different readings on this. It could mean something like outdated of like a classical metaphysics perhaps, or it could mean like any kind of philosophical investigation on the nature of X, armchair philosophy, if you like. So these are different views, and I mean some kind of so-called revisionary metaphysics that Banks would like to apply and to attribute to Mach, I think are just fall into the category of armchair metaphysics. And if this is what Mach was against in his anti-metaphysical remarks, then it makes the point of Banks, it makes it difficult. I mean, perhaps in order to support it, I agree that he means that these views are compatible, but we need to see more of what Mach actually meant under metaphysics, or Bank has to give us an account of that, and I'm not sure it's going to work so well. So that's about your second point, and then on your first point, that was about the. So you raised the issue so well. If in the case of agreeable and disagreeable sensations, they seem to give rise to some action, or they seem to give rise to something. Okay, and if you want to explain this kind of relation between the pleasant feeling and what comes after the pleasant feeling, it seems that you cannot get rid of the concept of causality. That was your point, right?
Yeah, and also I think that Mach kind of relies on that in order to explain the difference between a physical and a psychological relation. So because then he explains, so a sensation is something that refers to the body. Why does it refer to the body? Because so in this kind of specific relation, it plays a causal role because of pleasure and pain.
But I mean, I'm not sure to get your point, because when we talk about sensations, we talk about perhaps something like that are pleasurable or pleasant or displeasant, and it seems that what is pleasant or displeasant is the feeling, and not I don't know, the stimulation, or the wavelengths in the color perception, etc. Yes, I agree with that. But do you need in order to state that, you need a concept of causality? I'm not sure you do.
No, I think you need some sort of causal power to explain. So, of course, there are two sides. One thing is the feeling, the other. But it does seem that Mach relies on the kind of reaction that you have in order to explain body. So, sensation does play a kind of causal role in explaining why the body moves in the way it does. And then you do need some sort of causal. This is not only my interpretation. This is, for example, externals. That you need some sort of causal power of elements in themselves in order to explain certain relations between the elements and the complexes. So that's why I actually asked you, because if I understood you right, the functional relation that you draw is a relation between elements and complexes, right? So it's not about psychology and physics or sensations and elements. And then you say that's not a causal relation. But it does seem that Mach sometimes relies for these explanations in causal powers of the elements over the complexes. So you need some sort of explanation for why the complex body moves in a certain way, and the elements plays this kind of role.
Yes. Okay. So you would say so. So you say Mach would need some to attribute some kind of causal powers to the elements if they are. If they're said to work or to be connected in a specific complex and not in another, so that would be your
that's the point.
Yeah. Well, but I think Mach doesn't argue for this. I think in his view, he doesn't need that concept, that relation of causality. I mean, it's just these elements are connected together. That forms a complex, and if your interest is on the physiological level, then it's just a physiological complex. And if your interest is on the psychological level, then it's just a psychological complex. So your point would be to say, but it's not simply about interest. There are perhaps some internal, some relations between the elements that involve some causality, and that makes it that it's not fully, a matter of interest or something like this.
Yeah, and also you have to explain the interests themselves, right? So what is a psychological interest and a physiological interest if you only have elements, no causal relations?
Yeah.
So why is when you connect the element to a body is a psychological relation? Since all relations are equal, why is this specific complex in relation to this specific element is a psychological relation, whereas the other is a purely physiological relation? You have no grounds to make a distinction between both, I would say, unless you assume something internal in the elements, in the relation between the elements and the complex itself.
Yeah, okay. I think I see your point. Right. No, I mean, the thesis that Mach defends is that you don't need that relation of causality. That I mean, if you are doing physiology, I mean, what you're dealing with are these stimulations. If you're doing physics, what you're dealing with in the case of colors are wavelengths, and that's it. And they aggregate or they form a complex of wavelengths, or they form a complex of sensations, depending on the perspective. So. But so, I mean, you would attribute some kind of petitio principii to Mach in the end. I mean, that would be your point, is that, I mean, but it doesn't explain why we adjust these, we attribute these elements the kind of relation they have, or something like this.
Yeah, I mean, so how do you justify the perspective? So you have different perspectives, psychological perspectives, physical perspectives. So on what grounds can we make those distinctions? And then he would say, psychological perspective is the one that relates an element to a body. Okay, but then a body is nothing but a complex of elements itself. So why is the body such a specific kind of complex? And then you have to make certain distinctions. And unless you explain a certain kind of specific relation between the element and the complex, I think you cannot say what is a psychological perspective and a physical perspective in the relation between a complex and an element.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point, but still, my feeling is that, I mean, Mach's answer to this could be perhaps something like this, that goes, I would say, in some kind of pragmatist direction. That you unify somehow, specific elements together, given a certain interest that you have, be it for psychological investigation, be it for physiology, etc. So, and then it's just a matter of pragmatic in a sense, so if you like, so that avoids, the problem of, okay, but what is actually motivating, these relations? It's just, we have different interests, we have different sciences, and we pursue different goals, and that's the end of the story. So I mean, that's the way I understand Mach's, or I would reconstruct Mach's answer to that objection, which is probably not very satisfying, but I think it's the kind of answer that Mach would provide. Thanks, Lucas.
Okay, thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Professor Fréchette. So we have now a Q&A session for questions from the audience. Okay, Brenda. Question by Brenda, postdoctoral student.
Hi.
How you doing? I think your interpretation is great because you deal with the best of the both worlds and avoid so many problems. But a question comes to mind when I think about Gestalt. If perceiving melody is different from perceiving sensations of music notes that are temporarily distributed, then when we have the representations of melody, which are outside of space and time, then because of this, in this scenario, the source of these representations cannot be an affection of the sense. Therefore, there must be some other non-sensory psychic activity that makes such representations possible. So in a way, you'd be something like subjectively creating the melody, which would go in the direction of another reading of Reich, the Nuss's reading. So how does this relate to what you are proposing?
Yeah, right. This is an interesting question on when we talk about Gestalt qualities. Of course, there are these two different views that are defended. The Graz model is more theory of production. That what you have is a production, so to speak. When you see these four notes in Meinong's case that are displayed in a relation with one another, forming a square, for example. Well, it is something that is superimposed, so to speak, on the contents of presentation themselves. So it is an activity. It is not something that is perception involves, in that case, some kind of activity, and it involves the production of Gestalt. That's correct. And then there's this other theory, more in the Berlin side on that was defended by the Berlin psychologists, so that we have actually that we just it's not production, we just see the form. So your question was, where would my
Yes. You relate with a type of a rise reading. So it's same the direction as Benussi or no?
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting question. I think what I will not answer it, but I can say that, and perhaps that would bring some element of answer to your question. I think what we find in Mach is this connection between, the muscular sensations and the content that are perceived. And so in his view, it was a necessary connection in the early remarks on räumlichen Sehen, on spatial seeing. But this kind of relation of necessity, okay, we can put it aside, but what Ehrenfels takes from this is the idea that whenever I have let's say visual perception of something that is structured like I don't know, a triangle or something, I perceive the whole, I perceive not only the parts, but I perceive the parts in relation together, and I perceive thereby the whole, the gestalt, and I have this particular perception of, there's a quality of the form that I perceive. So, and I think it connects well with Mach, with what Mach has to say, but I think Mach would remain neutral, in my view at least, on whether we are producing these forms or we are just perceiving them as they are. He would probably remain neutral because, perhaps for just one trivial reason, in a sense, is that he remains neutral on the nature of these elements. So, but
the thing for me, it's for special from the point of view of the space. It's better to answer this question than in something like a melody that is distributed at the time, because then we have to know how the memory takes a place in this, and how this is not like a sensation thing or a production or a representation, and how these things connect with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know really what is your take on this, because I think you have probably a suggestion behind your question.
Also, the thing with the monism, it's like, for me, you have a lot of good sides, because you can throw your point of view, but then you commit with what?
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. Well, I think or what I call the Graz view when we want to understand Mach, what I suggest is that we remain actually, and I think this is what we find at least in Meinong, perhaps not in Benussi, but at least in Meinong and in Ehrenfels in any case. So we remain metaphysically neutral. It's not a theory about what is out there in the world. It's a theory about how we just have contact, or we are in relation with what we perceive. So that makes it a theory that is metaphysically neutral, which, I mean, also brings us problem if we want to answer the question. So but what do you think you actually perceive? So is it something that exists, and so on? So I'm afraid I cannot really answer your question. So is it a production theory or not? I think it is basically how Ehrenfels also considered his theory of Gestalt. I mean, when you look at Ehrenfels' theory doesn't tell us anything about the nature of the objects that we're perceiving, or the nature of melodies. He just thinks melodies are interesting because they are transposable, which means that you can have, so to speak, the same melody in a different keys. And so he's focusing on these kind of perceptual objects, but he remains neutral on what kind of objects these are. So I would say it's neither nor. It's neither the Vorstellungstheory, the Produktionstheorie, nor the Berlin School. It is let's say an underdetermined view about Gestalt, as Ehrenfels' theory is, in my view at least.
No, okay, thank you, Fréchette.
Thank you for your question.
Send me an email later and talk
Okay.
about.
Okay, so now we have a question by Professor Evandro, and then from another from the audience. So, sir.
Ça va, Fréchette.
Oh, hello, Evandro.
Salué, il dit que c'est beaucoup de journée pour activer la voie. I have a simple question. Your talk was so interesting, but I'd like to hear you if you could say something more about philosophy of mind, because your reading of Mach of interesting solution to several current problems in philosophy of mind. And could you say your reading of a solution or even a new interpretation for the Frank Jackson Mary's Room? Maybe what Lucas Baccarat talked about when you need to think the problem of color, but to perspective of solution is leads to Frank Jackson problem directly.
That's an interesting point. So so how would that? So perhaps you one way to rephrase this would be to say, okay, what would Mach say if confronted to Frank Jackson's argument, or the experiment of thought, the thought experiments that he suggested that Frank Jackson suggested with Mary and the black and white, the colors in the black and white room, right?
All right.
Yeah, this is interesting. So I mean, I think in Banks' view of Mach, Bank would attribute to Mach a kind of identity theory view. So what Mach would answer to your question, I believe, if he was if Eric Banks would answer to your question, that would be probably the way he would answer to the question. So if he was still alive, but is to say, well, I mean, Mary doesn't learn any new facts when she leaves the room in black and white. And since she doesn't learn any new facts, then there's nothing special about her experience when she leaves the black and room, the room in black and white. So I mean, he would just deny, according to Banks' account, I believe, he would just deny that there is something new that you can learn, or he would say, if we try to be a bit more charitable now, or he could say something like this, if he could say, well, perhaps she learned something new when she left the room in black and white, but then I mean, she didn't have a complete knowledge of the physiology and the neurology of colors. So I think in Eric Banks' view, there's nothing. There might be something that she learns, but we could put it that way. When we say she learns something new when she gets out of the black and white room, let's say in that kind of neutral monist view of Mach, what that would mean is that what that would mean, and then that doesn't mean that she actually learns something new, but she just gets a complementary information about the data. It's just so she gets, let's say, the psychological side of the information that she didn't have. but since we are neutral monists, if we are in that case, in the case of Mach, then this is not something new. This is just an addition, a nice addition, but it doesn't change anything about the data. So she technically she didn't learn something new. So that preserves the intuition, but it's just that she gets information that just correlates on both sides, and so she wouldn't learn anything new. I think that would be my feeling, is that this would be Mach's account of the black and white room in Frank Jackson. So he's not sharing that intuition that Jackson tries to argue for, namely that, if Mary knew all the facts about colors, about red, and she learned something new when she went out, then she didn't knew. Then it's impossible that she knew all the facts. So physicalism is false. So I think in Banks' reconstruction of Mach, physicalism cannot be false. So in that view, then she didn't learn anything new. In my view of Mach, would Mach accept something like this? I'm not sure. Perhaps, in my reconstruction, it would be some kind of translation. Mach would say, when we say she learned something new, it makes sense, but it means something else. And I think this is what Mach could probably be saying. But I think, the bottom line is, I think he would accept, he would reject Frank Jackson's argument. I'm pretty sure. In all accounts of Mach, for different reasons, but he would reject it.
Yes.
What do you think, Evandro?
Oh, I'm following you. I've read so much already, and then given a lot of insight, and it's so interesting. Okay. Maybe it's a Brenton influence that you never give up of emergence of mental. Then physicalism is something that is not so easy to fight again.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, and I hope you'll be here next year.
Yes, I hope so.
Okay, so I think we have a question there from the audience. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah.
So, thank you, Professor Fréchette. Your lecture was very interesting and helpful to me, because I have been trying to understand some of the Wittgenstein's criticisms on Mach, especially made in the philosophical remarks. And I have the assumption that Wittgenstein is actually targeting Russell or the Vienna cycle when he's writing about Mach. And I have a question that could be simple. I have the impression that even besides the disagreement on the readings, Mach has an influence on both programs by Russell and by the Vienna cycle of the so-called externalism programs or construction programs. And I have the impression that this influence could be traced by the non-causal dependence thesis. And if you agree on this.
I didn't get, it was not so clear, the connection was not so good. So could you just repeat the last part of your question? I didn't get it right.
I said that I have the impression that that besides the disagreements on the readings, Mach has an influence on both programs, on Russell's and on the Vienna cycle program. And I have the impression that this influence could be traced by the non-causal dependencies.
Okay. Oh yeah. Good. That's a good point. And yes, absolutely. And I agree with you. And that's what I meant also, at least implicitly, because it wasn't very clear in the talk, but is that that's what I meant when I said that my view is actually compatible with the others, because I don't think, that this is a disjunction of views. It's not either this view or that view or that view. And my take is that if we put more focus on the non-dependence thesis, on the non-causal dependence thesis, we get a more interesting or a broader picture of Mach than if we put our emphasis, let's say, on phenomenalism or on neutral monism. But you are right. I think we can also say, if we look closer into the matter, into the influence of Mach on the Vienna Circle and on Russell, we could also see, but actually it's perfectly compatible, or this influence is explained, we could say, also because they received this non-causal dependence thesis of Mach. So yes, absolutely, and I think one doesn't exclude the other. I think that certainly played a role in the development of neutral monism and in the development of phenomenalism, or in the Vienna Circle position. But I think, these receptions, the way they are construed, put more emphasis on other aspects of the influence. But this is just a point about how these reconstructions are structured, and not so much about the real influence that was behind it. But you're perfectly right. I think we could see within the reception of Mach in the Vienna Circle also strains that show that they were aware of this thesis, of course, because it's a fairly general thesis, and they were aware of this thesis and accepted it to some extent. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with you.
Thank you, Professor. I have just another small question. If there is any records of the discussions between Russell and the Vienna Circle, between those disagreements, their readings, if there is any letters or records,
Well, I would be very interested in that material, and I think we have. I have people working on this in Geneva that are way more knowledgeable about the Vienna Circle than I am. So that would be actually these persons you should address your question to, but they're not here online. So obviously, and perhaps also Lucas could eventually answer this question on the relation with Carnap, because Carnap also had had a very large and complex diaries that he wrote like every day of his life, basically reporting on every single event he did or attended to. And I'm mentioning Lucas because he worked in Vienna with Dembeck, that worked on this. So perhaps these Lucas and the people in Vienna would be better placed to answer to your question. But I'm pretty sure they did. But I don't know. I don't know exactly the content of these discussions.
Thank you very much.
So I think we have one more question from the audience here. Okay, please.
Fréchette. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. And I have I think it's a historical doubt, but I just want to know that you clarified that Mach's position about the problems that he was treating in this position that presented here was aiming to maybe unify or put together the physics and the psychology and physiology. But at the end here, you put some in your slide that the views you put are not just philosophical views, but also concrete receptions or concrete preoccupations. But I wanted you to know to give a more maybe a more explicit definition of philosophy with the aim of phenomenology defended by Mach, because I know he was from a tradition, mainly as I know in physics, that tried to avoid hypothetical elements in the description and experience. So, is this? Can you give me precise definition of what understand as philosophy? Because you just mentioned the term philosophy here at the end of the presentation.
Yes, right. One way to put it is that my point was in that slide and in this remark here at the end and also at the beginning. It's a meta-philosophical point. It's a point about what we do actually when we do history of philosophy. And my concern was, and I think it is also behind what some people do, like Eric Banks, I think, but also even before that, like people writing, on Mach since many years. So what they do when they do history of philosophy, sometimes that's my impression. What they do is that they do that kind of reconstruction of the view of an author, in this case of Mach, as if it were, something that you could just, write down, write down, that's perfectly clear, and then you just reconstruct it logically or whatever else. And by doing so, I have the impression that these persons believe that, that follows from what Mach says, that follows exactly, and this is the pure philosophical view of what Mach had to say. My point is to say against that is that, well, as historians of philosophy, we have preoccupations also. We have an agenda, if you like. And as an historian of philosophy, I'm interested in some authors more than in some others. And the reasons for this is probably a matter of perhaps sympathies or something, or whatever, if you want to put it mildly. But I would say more seriously, it is a matter of the kind of agenda you have as a philosopher. So if I think that everything is discourse, then I will work probably more on Derrida than on Ernst Mach. And so this is a very general point. But what I want to say by pointing at this is that when philosophers reconstruct the view of a philosopher, we have also to consider that they are also using their own agenda in reconstructing the author. And but my impression is that while they do so, like people like Banks or people also in the Vienna Circle, even more strongly in the Vienna Circle, or at least in the case of in the case of Schlick, is that they're not really aware that that's just actually their own agenda. They're just reading themselves into the text of Mach to some extent. So given that we're always somehow, to some extent, following an agenda, then I think it is important to consider that what we do when we read a philosopher, we have a reception of a philosopher, that there are different receptions of a philosopher, and that we should also factor that in in our reconstructions. That's basically my point. And that the impression is that this debate between phenomenalism and neutral monism is not a debate about receptions. It's a debate about the pure philosophical views, if you like, which doesn't really make sense, or it's just partially makes sense from the perspective of an historian of philosophy. So that was my point. And that's the point of where I bring in my reading, my Graz reading, where just to give a broader account of the reception.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much.
Okay, well, you're welcome.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Fréchette, for your photography, for answering all the questions. With this question, we conclude our morning sessions of the 16th meeting on the origins of contemporary philosophy, and which will be followed in by the last afternoon session and the last communication session. Thank you.
Thank you.